Hi, hello everybody. So I'm Karen Jex. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at Crunchy Data. So let's talk about how Postgres is misused and abused in the wild. First, just for fun, a few facts about me. This is me in my happy place, splattered in mud. So I live in the mountains in France. And you'll usually find me, when I'm not playing with databases, out on one of my bikes, road, gravel, or mountain bike, depending on how I'm feeling. So obviously, I'm going to take advantage of being here in Vancouver to go to Whistler for the weekend. Other than that, so I came to being a senior solutions architect via a long history as a database administrator. I was a DBA for about 20 years, but I was once described as quite personable for a DBA. So. Yeah, I've recently been elected to the PostgreSQL Europe board. I am leading the very, very recently created PostgreSQL Europe Diversity Task Force. And I like speaking at Postgres conferences, but also at developer conferences. I like going out to PyCons and DjangoCons, and I've got a Ruby conference that I'm going to soon, and actually meeting some of the users of Postgres who absolutely love Postgres. It's always nice to see how much love there is for Postgres in those places. Okay, so when I speak at developer events, I usually start with a confession. And I say, I'm really sorry, I'm not a developer. But then I show them this diagram that kind of shows my career to date. And I explain that I've worked with databases all this time, so you really can trust me to know what I'm talking about when I talk about databases. But now I'm here at this conference, I feel I need two apologies, confessions. Firstly, I'm not a developer. And secondly, I probably know maybe as much about databases as some people in this room, but obviously a lot less about databases than some of the people in this room. So we'll see how it all goes. And then, so the other thing that I wanted to say is that, as you can see, as a database administrator and then consultant and now senior solutions architect, I've always been a user of the database. So I always felt that I was kind of an advanced database user, but still a user of the database. And it wasn't until I came to work with Postgres that it even crossed my mind that I could or should be involved in actually shaping the direction of the database product or system that I was using. And then just for a bit of humor in the slides, this is my new favorite Instagram account in Otter News. And this pretty much is how I feel about my day-to-day job. Okay, so there's a very long red line on this alternative view of my career to date. So I started out as an Oracle database administrator 25 years ago now. I did a tiny bit of Sybase and SQL Server, but I tried to move away from those as quickly as I could. And I'm ashamed to say that I didn't actually discover Postgres until 2019. But once I did discover Postgres, you can see it didn't take me very long to ditch that red part of the graph and move over to working exclusively with Postgres. And I'm very much hoping that that blue line will continue for a long time to come. So although you can see I'm a relative newcomer to the Postgres project, I come with that background of having worked with other systems, including big proprietary systems like Oracle. And I think having that different perspective can actually be really valuable. So it's fairly safe from everything I've said so far to assume that I love Postgres. Given how quickly I ditched Oracle once I discovered Postgres and how invested I am in the Postgres community. It really is an amazing project. As we all know, it's full of features. The users absolutely love it. Like I say, there's so much love for Postgres when I go off to the developer conferences. It holds its own in terms of performance, security. It's got the whole rich ecosystem of tools and extensions, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we all hear, I know I hear a lot from users, is it just works. That really is what people feel about Postgres. But of course, there are always things that we can do better. So my talk today takes inspiration from some of the creative ways that people find to use Postgres. And it's easy, obviously, when we're in those situations to just tell the user not to do something, or just say, well, why on earth are you doing that? But, I mean, this is a very well-used picture. There are often very good reasons that someone's chosen to do something the way they do it. And the important thing is for us to listen and understand that. So here's what often happens, and I know I am absolutely guilty of this. Here's what often happens. We find that the user's doing something strange. We find out about it at that stage, the something goes wrong stage. There's probably all sorts of weird stuff going on out there that we have no idea about because it's just, it's working, it's fine, there aren't any errors. But we find out about things at this something goes wrong stage. There's a message on the mailing list, there's a support ticket, there are Slack messages, something like that. And then the immediate response is usually, well, don't do that. Why are you doing that? To us, it's often really obvious that something isn't a good idea. And so in that case, the user, if they can work around what's happening, if they've got some kind of fix for their immediate issue, they're just going to completely ignore us and carry on doing whatever it was they were doing. And none of us learn anything in that situation. So, okay, what should we probably do? We're still going to get this. The user's still going to do something strange, and something's still going to go wrong. We're not going to change that. So what should we do after that point? We try to understand why the user's doing that. So what are they actually trying to do? What's their use case? What are their actual requirements? What else did they try before they came to the decision that this was the right way to go, this was the right thing for them to do? Once we've done that, then it's probably fine to do some education to gently explain why actually that's probably not the best way of doing things. It's probably not a good idea to set max connections to 1 million, to allocate a millicore to your database nodes, to only use pgdump as your backup strategy. And then we can suggest and explain some alternatives to them. Have you thought about doing this? This is what we consider to be best practice, and try and explain how they might do things. And then once we've done that, try and think about what the exchange actually tells us. So as I said, we wanted to know, why did the user think that that was the best way forward, that that was the best solution? And the most important thing probably is, how can we improve that? What can we do about that to help people to actually make the right decisions? It is obviously really, really easy to blame the user. So we're going to say things like, but you're using the wrong tool for that. You shouldn't be implementing that architecture. You've set those parameters wrong. Or, no, you don't understand. You've not got it. Or well, you need to upgrade. Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much what Steve says. Everything happens for a reason, but sometimes the reason is that you're Steve and you make bad decisions. Okay, but maybe we should think about it slightly differently. Maybe the user's using the wrong tool because it's the only one they know about, or because it's the only one that they can understand the documentation for, the only one that had enough examples in it that they could figure out what they were supposed to do, or maybe it's the first one that came up in a Google search. Maybe the functionality that the user wants doesn't exist. Maybe they've implemented a particular architecture because they're working around constraints in their own infrastructure that they can't actually do anything about. Maybe the most appropriate architecture for their use case isn't well documented or explained. Maybe the user doesn't understand something because there aren't enough training resources, or we've not made it clear to the users where they can find the training resources that they needed. If the user's on an old version, what's holding them back from upgrading? Why do they feel that they're better off staying on an older version and living with issues rather than upgrading? Is there anything that we can do to make that seem like as though it's not an insurmountable task? Of course, it's not just Postgres that's used wrong. All sorts of tools are used wrong. And this is one of my all-time favorites, was the time that Public Health England managed to lose almost 16,000 positive COVID test results because they decided to use the wrong tool. They decided to open a file containing millions of records in Excel. And when people do things like that, they blame the tool. Excel did something wrong, apparently. So this was a quote from a PHE official. I'm just going to read it. It was down to a combination of human error and IT. That is, a human using IT. It's fundamentally an IT error, but there is a bit of human error involved too. Yeah. And then even an article by The Guardian's tech editor said that Excel had caused the 16,000 rows to be lost. So I think that's one of the things that we need to be mindful of, that regardless of the actual cause of an issue, if something goes wrong when people are using Postgres, they will blame Postgres. They will think that it's Postgres' fault. And obviously, we want to avoid that. That's not good for anybody. Another thing is that not everyone's a database expert. Most of the people in this room are database experts. We all know a lot about databases. Some people in this room, as I've said, know a lot more than I do about databases. But actually, I've had to really learn to be mindful of the fact that not everyone I talk to is. The traditional DBA role exists less and less. So in my experience, the development side of things, so designing and creating the schemas, writing the code, etc., is almost always done by development teams. Now, I have a lot of respect for application developers, but they don't necessarily have database knowledge. I've spoken to lots of them, and they don't know what data, like normalization is. They don't know what acid properties are. So there's a lot of information that we think's evident because we've lived with it, we've worked with it for so many years, but actually not everybody knows that. And these are the people in general that are designing the systems that are then going to go into production. Once they're in production, it seems to be mainly infrastructure teams that are looking after them. And again, these infrastructure teams have a lot of knowledge about all sorts of things, but not necessarily databases. So they don't necessarily know all the intricacies of how you need to manage high availability for a database system, how you need to manage disaster recovery for a database system. Okay, so I'm suspecting that this is the actual section of the talk that most of you are interested in, which is the actual real-world examples of what people are doing. I haven't named any names because, I'd like to protect the innocent. Most of the things that I'll talk about are actually fairly normal. People are doing them again and again. We see support tickets, we get emails, I get calls from my customers telling me about these things that they're doing. And it's obviously only a small selection. I am not even going to vaguely try to cover all of the different bizarre and interesting things that people might be doing with Postgres. Okay. Users still insist that they have to stay on a specific minor release of Postgres. So I quite often hear, oh, but we have to use Postgres 13.7 or 15.3 or 12.14. The documentation is actually pretty unambiguous about this. So we've said the community considers performing minor upgrades to be less risky than continuing to run an old minor version. We recommend that users always run the current minor release associated with their major version. It's very clear. We are telling users that they should be on the latest minor release. But for some reason, this message isn't getting through. So it's in the documentation. I know that there have been talks about it. Various people, I believe Leticia has a good talk about upgrading Postgres. I know that Jimmy Angelikos chaired a panel discussion at PostgreSQL EU 2022, I think it was, about upgrading and what people see as the challenges, but why ultimately it is a very important thing to do. So what are we doing wrong here? What does this kind of exchange tell us? Should we have the information that I showed in a more prominent position somewhere in the documentation? Do we need some kind of public service announcements? Do we need to be walking around with megaphones telling people this? It's just one of the examples where our message doesn't seem to be getting through to the users. Other users are stuck on a particular major version of Postgres. So we can only use PostgreSQL 12 at the moment, might not be too bad, but we still have customers using older versions of Postgres. Was that 10? Any advance on 10? Pardon?
I can go way lower than 10.
Okay. There are various reasons, obviously, for this phenomenon of insisting on running a particular major version of Postgres. Sometimes the database is used to support third-party software, and it's that third-party software vendor that has only certified their product against a particular version. Sometimes the vendor also specifies a particular minor release of Postgres, which is obviously going towards what we saw on the previous slide. Sometimes they're scared to upgrade. People are worried that it's going to be a huge project. It's going to take too long. There'll be too much downtime. They need to make too many application changes. It's too much risk. They have all sorts of reasons that they're scared of doing major Postgres upgrades. Sometimes, thank you, Evan, for this one, there really is nothing we can do. It's a bit tricky when we've already explained that they're hitting a bug or that the functionality doesn't exist in the version that they're using and the solution is to upgrade, but if they refuse to upgrade, it's very difficult to help. Okay, backup and recovery gets its whole own section because there are just so many things that people do in using Postgres in interesting and interesting ways. As someone who was a DBA for a very long time, I think this is probably the section that worries me the most because it scares me. I don't like it when my customers are in a situation where I know that they could lose data. I want all my customers to be able to restore their database if something goes wrong. I want that warm, fuzzy feeling of knowing that everything's safe. This we do see still a lot. Oh, but I'm running a PG dump every day. What do you mean I can't do a point-in-time recovery? So don't get me wrong. Obviously, I think PG dump is a fantastic utility. It's very useful. It definitely has good reasons to exist. It has good reasons to be used. But obviously not as a backup and recovery tool if you need point-in-time recovery. The first sentence of the description here, that's great. It says pgdump extract a PostgreSQL database into a script file or other archive file. But then in the description, it says pgdump is a utility for backing up a PostgreSQL database. Well, it does back things up. I'm not going to disagree with that. But users, when they hear for backing up a Postgres database, they think backup and recovery tool. The rest of the documentation for pgdump does then talk about dumps. It doesn't go on to continue talking about backups. We need to be able to recover to any point in time, so we take backups every 20 minutes. I have explained multiple times to this particular user over the last 2 years that really they do not need to be running backups every 20 minutes. Actually, they can't run backups every 20 minutes because the backups take longer than 20 minutes to run. They've got all of the infrastructure and configuration in place to do point-in-time recovery, and I've explained it to them. I've explained to them how it works multiple times, but they don't trust it. They don't believe that they can restore their database and recover to a point in time. This one, I've still not figured out how to fix. I mean, we have shown them a point-in-time recovery. It's there, it works, it's in place, but they still don't believe it. If anybody wants to send me suggestions as to how I can talk to this particular customer, I would be extremely happy to do that because I would really like them to stop trying to take backups every 20 minutes. Oh, we don't need a database backup tool. We take daily snapshots of our data volumes. This is not one customer. This is many customers, many users. And to us, it's like, well, you don't use volume snapshots to back up a database, but databases are huge now. You know, we have customers, obviously, with multiple terabyte databases with large numbers of terabytes in their databases. As I said before, you've got infrastructure people that are looking after databases. They don't want to, or, you know, they don't think about using different tools. They've got volume snapshots in place to back up the rest of their infrastructure. Why would they even think that the database is any different? They either don't want to or can't wait for multiple hours or even days for an absolutely huge database to be backed up. So there are some good reasons for them to be using snapshots as a tool to help with their database backup and recovery. So the challenge comes when, you know, as we know, they don't consider all of the implications of using just volume snapshots for their backup strategy. And they don't test it, or at least they don't test it under load. Oh, but it worked. I restored from a volume snapshot and it was fine. I've heard so many times. Okay, was it your production database? Was it running under load? It's another example where actually the Postgres documentation is pretty clear about the requirements for using volume snapshots as part of a backup strategy. I'm not necessarily expecting people to read this, but just to say that the documentation does discuss the fact that you need a frozen snapshot, that crash recovery will take place when you restore a volume snapshot and open Postgres, that you need to carefully read your file system documentation. If you've got your wall on a different file system to your data directory, if you've got multiple table spaces in different file systems, you need to be able to do the simultaneous frozen snapshot. But the message still, again, doesn't seem to be getting through. Now, I don't know whether some of this is the fantastical claims that are made by the storage vendors. I know that there are some backup tools out there that aren't specific database backup tools that say, oh, well, we can back up and restore your Postgres database using volume snapshots. So perhaps some of it's that, that people don't think they need to worry about the details. I have no idea when our last successful backup was taken. I don't understand not monitoring your database backups, but we have so many customers who will put a cron job in place to perform backups, and that's it. Well, we've implemented backups. That's, you know, tick, done. So I obviously coordinated with my colleagues and asked for their own war stories when doing this. And one of them I'm going to read because it must have come from a point of pain, because they didn't just write a small sentence. They said, not realizing their cron backups are misconfigured, which leads to wall never being expired by PG backrest, which leads to archive command filing, which leads to primary running out of disk space, which leads to Patroni failover, which leads to the replicas running out of disk space too. So I can only assume that my colleague had just had to help a customer to recover from that particular situation when I asked. My backup server was in my failed data center, and now I can't fail over to my DR site. Or we still get people that are performing a backup, but to their database server. There's, yeah, I mean, we have cloud storage now. You know, you can back your database up to wherever you want, but that's the architecture. We are going to back up to our primary database node, to our primary data center. You know, it's quite nice having everything in one place. It's neat and tidy. Oh, we don't need a database backup tool. We've got some custom shell scripts for that. Again, comment from my colleague, a different colleague this time, who must have recently had a painful experience. I'm not going to read it, but you know, yeah, specific issues with a homegrown script that wasn't working. We have fully functional well-tested, reliable, performant, community created and maintained backup and recovery tools. People don't need to be writing their own shell scripts to do backup and recovery. They don't even cost anything. It's not like people have to go out and buy these backup and recovery tools. But people still think that they'll do better themselves by creating custom shell scripts. This one was, Federico alerted me to this one on LinkedIn, and he said that he sees a lot of these. So this was somebody, and I have blocked out the name, who is apparently a Postgres database administrator, giving a useful hint to other Postgres users about how you can write a script to, quote, automatically back up your Postgres databases. Federico replied, explaining that that's not the best way to back up a Postgres database. I think he said that it was actually the script saves it onto the same machine anyway. And shortly after we tried to interact with this person, because I actually replied saying, I'm actually really interested. I would like to know why people are doing this instead of using one of the tools. But the post was deleted shortly after that, so we will never know. Yep, people are still deleting wall files. I've got lots on my slide here. I don't think there's all that much more to say, but I know that there was the change from PGXlog to PGWall so that people wouldn't see log and think that it was okay to delete, but people are still doing this. And again, I think the documentation is pretty clear. I've not got a quote on here, but I'm sure it says that you will not be able to open your database if you do this. I know that my colleagues have written blog posts about this. I know that other companies have written blog posts about this. I know that we frequently tell users, do not do this, yet people still do. So I don't know what we do about this, but it is still a problem. Oh yeah, my suggestion here, do we need to append do not delete to the name of every WAL file? And remove it once it's archived, but hey. Yeah. Okay, moving on to application. Yeah. So, the app developers said that each of our, 100 app servers, I exaggerate, each of our 10 app servers needs 1,000 connections. Okay. Or we kept getting connection errors, so we set max connections to 100K. People are still, again, setting really, really high values of max connections. I know that it's a lot less of an issue than it used to be, but I'm hypothesizing, I suspect that it's an education issue, that we still need to explain to users how Postgres works best, what the implications are if they set this too high, if they have too many concurrent connections, possibly people coming from other database management systems. Oh, the expecting magic, I like this one. Well, why doesn't Postgres automatically route my read-only connections to my standby database? Well, because you didn't tell Postgres that it was a read-only connection. You didn't send it to the, your standby database. So, I get quite a lot, but I've got a read-write connection pool and I've got a read-only connection pool. I want Postgres to know where it's sending those without making any application changes. I think Postgres probably needs more than a millicore usually. So I had a conversation about this earlier. We don't specify minimum resources for Postgres. And there are good reasons for that, because Postgres itself will run with tiny resources. You can run Postgres almost anywhere. You can install it, you can start it up, it will run. The issue, obviously, is once people start putting real-life workloads through that. So I'd say it's fairly obvious that Postgres isn't going to perform well if you only give it a millicore, if you hardly give it any memory, etc. But as I said, on the other hand, we don't actually tell people what the minimums are. I don't know whether we can give people some rules of thumb, but there are so many moving parts there. I was trying to see if there was anything else I want to say. So yeah, again, does it even make sense for us to try and tell users what the minimums are? Probably not. There seems to be quite a lot of misunderstanding about how synchronous replication works. This is one that I get a lot of questions about, a lot of customers being surprised at how things are acting. So they don't seem to understand what the different implications are on performance, on high availability, on durability. So we hear things like, I need synchronous replication, but it mustn't have any impact on my primary database. Okay, I mean, I think that's fairly intuitive, that if you implement synchronous replication, you're telling the primary to wait until something's been written to the standby, and you've got confirmation that it's been written to the standby. That's going to add some extra time. And the documentation does state that it will necessarily increase the response time for the requesting transaction with a minimum wait time at the round trip between primary and standby, but it still seems to surprise people. Or I implemented synchronous replication and now I can't write to my primary database. Again, I think that's fairly intuitive, that if something's gone wrong with your standby and you've asked the primary to wait until things have been written to that standby, your primary is going to have to wait for you to fix whatever's gone wrong. But again, people seem surprised about this. Or on the other hand, we'll get things like, I implemented synchronous replication, but my primary is still working, even though I lost my standby. And this one is usually when people are using Petroni, because Petroni prefers availability, by default, will prefer availability over the durability, the synchronous. The Petroni documentation does explain this. It explains the default behavior. So here it does explain manually shutting down or restarting the standby. There you go. So standby will signal the primary to release itself from synchronous standby duties before PostgreSQL shutdowns are initiated. It explains what the default behavior is. And in the next paragraph, I believe it's only one paragraph later, explains that you can use the synchronous mode strict if you want to ensure that you stay in synchronous replication mode. So I actually find the synchronous replication section of the Postgres docs fairly clear, easy to understand, complete. But I don't know if that's because I've read them so many times, that I've used them so many times to help make sure that customers have got things set up in the right way. Maybe we need to look at people, like ask people who aren't so familiar with it to see what their initial impressions are when they read the documentation. Maybe it's not clear to them. Moving on, I want my Postgres database to behave exactly like my insert other RDBMS here database. Okay, we actually know what people mean there. It's usually, yeah. A lot of Postgres newbies aren't database newbies. They know about databases. They know about relational database. A lot of them have been working, like me, with Oracle for decades, potentially. So they do know a lot about databases. They know how to manage a relational database system, but they don't know Postgres. I find Postgres much easier to understand than I found Oracle. I find that there are plenty of places that I can go to get the information I need. But when I first started out, I did have to search around a bit to find resources that I could use. I didn't want to start from scratch and learn about databases. I just wanted to quickly get up to speed on, kind of what the differences were. So I think maybe there's some of that. But then there's also this one I learned about, functional fixedness. So cognitive bias that limits a person to use an object only in the way it's traditionally used, or only in the way that they're used to using something. So if they're used to using something like Oracle, well, if they've got a relational database management system, they're going to keep trying to use it in that known, familiar way. This, in case anyone's interested, and as an aside, is apparently a classic experiment to do with this functional fixedness thing. So people were given this set of items at the top here, and they were asked to use the things they'd been given, attach the candle to the wall. So most people, when presented with things in this way, saw this as thumbtacks that just happened to be in a box. So they were trying to do things like melt the candle, like use the thumbtacks to attach it directly to the wall. The expected solution is this one here. You use the box, put the candle in it, and attach the box to the wall. Apparently, I can't remember the actual details, when people were presented with the box separately to the tacks, they were more likely, considerably more likely, to come up with this solution. So people very much, if they're used to seeing something in a particular way, they will keep seeing it in that way. They don't have, in general, the imagination to see it in a different way. So maybe we need to help people to have the imagination to see a database as not necessarily Oracle. Okay, so we all know that Postgres is awesome. I've definitely not come here to suggest anything otherwise. Postgres is awesome. We have such a great set of tools that goes with Postgres. And actually, I think, in general, the documentation is pretty good. I think there are things we could probably all do to improve the documentation by talking to people about what they need from it, for example. But I think that we provide people with a fantastic product, good documentation, and good tools that they can use to actually manage their databases. But it's really easy to forget that not everybody that's working with Postgres is a database expert. And the other thing that I mentioned earlier, people will blame Postgres if something goes wrong. It's probably not Postgres' fault. It's probably not even the associated tool that they're using. But if something goes wrong, they will say, oh, Postgres did this. And we don't want that. None of us want people to be blaming Postgres. So whatever the reasons for things, it's good for all of us if we can help people to get the most out of Postgres and continue to think that it just works. Okay, so I think I've probably said most of those things. What does this all mean for us? Well, I think we really need to think about communication with the end users of Postgres. It's been fantastic for me over the last couple of years to be going to app developer conferences and talking to those people who absolutely love Postgres, but don't really know anything about databases. And that's been fascinating to me, and it's really given me a different perspective on things. So I think we need to listen to what they're trying to do, find out what they already know, and try and meet them there. Find out what they need in terms of training, what kind of tutorials or documentation they need to help them to learn things. I said before that they often don't know about things like database normalization. I mean, that kind of thing to me is fascinating. I imagine to most people in this room it's fascinating, but it's not necessarily something that's taught to application developers. And another thing that I found out from talking to people is that the app developers don't think that Postgres events and Postgres conferences are for them. So I think if we want people to know more about how to work with databases, we need to try and encourage more people, not necessarily to this event, which is very specific, but encourage more people who aren't Postgres experts to come along to the big Postgres events. And then the final bit, I will share these slides, but I would really, this obviously is just a small selection of things, and I know that everybody has their own war stories, everyone has their own things that they encounter that's being done wrong. I would love you to get in touch and tell me those, because I'd really like to improve the presentation, maybe to give it another time with some more information, information about which of these things are the most common. Obviously, this is mine and my colleagues' experiences mainly. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much.
So
Hi.
with RDS, the default max connections settings are really high. And so it feels like they've kind of caved to setting that default to a high thing because they've gotten the max connections problem probably more than a few times to AWS support. But in some ways, I think that reinforces the idea that that's okay. And it's just because the default max connections is set to here in RDS doesn't mean that you shouldn't have connection pooling.
That's really good. I didn't know that. So yeah, really good information. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely reinforcing that that's okay, but I can understand why they would do it, to want less work when they're getting these errors.
I know you talked a little bit about documentation. So what are other resources for people? Like if you're an application developer and you need to fix your connections, where do you go? Like if the Postgres docs don't have an example, what's next?
Well, the thing is that probably talking to a consultant would be, if you've got a use case in mind, then you're going to have to go to someone who has an idea of what you're going to need, what resources you're going to need for that use case. There are things out there to help you, like with rules of thumb for setting parameters, etc. But what the actual resources that you need for Postgres, it's so dependent on your workload that it's a really difficult question. It's really difficult to know, what do we do? Do we give people this information, or do we leave people to kind of figure it out? So yeah, sorry, that's a very non-answer.
I have a follow-up question. So, based on our experience, the connection number absolutely high definitely is a problem, but we also see connection churn is another problem.
You see what, sorry?
Connection churn, meaning that they create connection, run one query, tear it down. Sometimes we see that as even more damaging than just, I would just like to get your thoughts on that.
That's a really good point, yeah. And that, I think people see using things like PG Bouncer as complicated. We would recommend to people usually, obviously it's another of those, it depends, that, if you've got that kind of thing going on, then you're going to want connection pools. So you could use something like PG Bouncer at the database side, or you can use application connection pooling, whatever works. There are going to be different things in different situations. But yeah, absolutely, that rapid creating and tearing down. Hey, please don't ask me complicated questions.
Do you want me to pre-vet this?
I was just going to say, I'd be interested to know whether you agree, but it seems to me that some other database products have more of the things that we use external tools for built into the database itself. And I think some of the confusion that you're rightly reflecting on here, and I've seen many of the same things in my own experience at ADB, comes from the fact that the user picks PostgreSQL and then they kind of hope that they're done.
Yeah.
And they're not, because now they need to decide on PG Bouncer or PG Pool and PG Backrest or Barman and this thing or that thing.
Yeah.
And by the time they get done making they just don't know how to make all of those decisions. And then they're like, let me just do something.
Absolutely, yeah. And that reflects my own experience when I started working with Postgres. Like, great, I've installed Postgres, I've created myself a Postgres instance, I've learned how to create my database, my users, all that kind of thing. Now what do? I don't want a standalone database. Yeah, absolutely right. And that is not an easy thing for us to fix, but a good thing for us to reflect on.
But it is probably some of our jobs to try to fix.
Exactly. So absolutely good to reflect on and try and work out how we can make sure we get that message across and help people to do that. Yeah.
And Crunchy Data and Tembo and Amazon RDS would love to sell you a product that packages all of these tools together for you.
And yeah, again, that's why all of our companies exist and have products that put together all of those tools for you so that it's there in a package.
Yep. As one of those application developers, you were talking about hoping come to more of the conferences. I can absolutely echo that exact issue. That So as someone who has like an intermediate level of knowledge about Postgres, I still have no idea about how to use all the tooling associated with it. And we are a small shop, so we don't have a DBA.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily have it in the budget to hire consultants. And we're not running a big enough installation to like have it be a real big problem. And we're running on RDS, so we got like backups. So we got a bunch of the stuff kind of built in for us. But like a lot of that tooling, a lot of it feels less like, oh, this is Postgres, and it feels a lot more like this is some random tool. Like I don't know which of those tools are like, no, this is the one that's kind of like gold stamped by the community and by the teams, versus like this is just some like random repo on GitHub.
Yeah, that's
so like. So when you comes that decision paralysis, is like, what do I use? What should I use? What is actually okay for me to use? What am I going to blow up my production system with by using? So like just as an app developer who has some amount of knowledge about this stuff, but is not a sysadmin or a DBA, like just no clue on how to actually manage the database.
Yeah. May I ask you a question in exchange?
Absolutely.
What can we do to help with that? Because I absolutely accept what you're saying, and I think you're right.
I don't know off the top of my head. It's just like that's the like I'll run into situations where like I have a problem, and you kind of Google around and you find a half a dozen different places that use either they use this they use a lot of them will use this tool. This other one uses this one other thing. So it's creating a little bit of doubt that I'm using the right thing. Or it requires a little bit of extra know-how that's away from the database to be able to use it. But I find it mostly around the management of the database that I have just no clue what to do versus like actually using the database. Like you said, like once I have database I'm running, I'm connected to it, I'm good to go from there.
So it's the
it's all the infrastructure stuff that.
Okay. That is absolutely really good feedback. If you want to connect with me, then I would love to talk about it. Absolutely. Thank you.
I concur with him. I come from a developer background, but now I'm also on the customer side. I think it's still difficult to find the answer you want. So I'm just asking an open question, right? Has anyone actually tried to use ChatGPT with the Postgres questions? Because I have.
As an amusing exercise, yes. As an exercise for actually trying to do anything, no.
The reason why I ask is that sometimes you spell out a really good answer, sometimes it's really completely wrong, sometimes mixed with the MySQL.
I mean, it spits out the things that it's found on the internet. So some of that's good advice, and
I would suggest that maybe Postgres community on the documentation can publish a list of official best practice on common thing, right? This is the blast query for detecting table blow. This is the best practice, right? It's like, more like authoritative.
That assumes that the Postgres community can agree on those things. I digress, but yes,
at least will be a starting point, and then you can get feedback.
I take your point seriously, and
because there's no authoritative answer.
The idea of this talk was definitely not to try and come up with solutions for anything, but very much to try and start that kind of exchange where we're really thinking about, what can we do? We love Postgres. We want everyone else to love Postgres, and we want everyone to get the best out of it. How can we make sure that
like a recipe-based FAQ, right? Here's the top 10 scenario or top 10 things. Here's a recipe how you can do that. That'll be something.
I've got talks about that kind of thing.
I'm also an app developer and have a similar problem. The official documentation is probably not the place, but somewhere like the Postgres wiki, a table. Here are your options for backups. These are what these do well. These are what these don't do well.
I don't think, as the thing is, as the Postgres project, we probably don't want to be saying what things do or don't do well. We could, I guess we can factually say what functionality some of the things had, but may I ask you a question, Robert? I'm sure somewhere in the wiki or documentation, we do have links to tools, don't we?
We tend to avoid it for exactly the reason that you're saying, which is that we don't want to take sides.
Yeah.
But I think the point the users are raising is like, well, if we don't take sides, then they don't know.
Yeah.
And like those things seem like two halves of the same coin.
Exactly. I see
You
it.
can't both not take sides
Yeah.
and have them know what to do.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it really is a double-edged sword. It's, for me, one of the real strengths of the Postgres ecosystem that you have that choice. You're not forced to use just one tool, but it causes confusion. So we absolutely need to think about how we can help people through that.
I think we're out of time, but thank you guys so much, and another round of applause for Karen. This was lovely.